so we have come to the final segment for today, which is our final keynote speaker, Alex Freeman. To introduce her, I'd like to invite my colleague, Leonard Lee, the Deputy Director for the Lloyd's Register Foundation Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk. I just learned that we have 10 words in my institute's name. I've just been saying it all the time. Leonard, please, I'd like to hand the time over to you.
So in the last 2 days, we have learned a lot, really, about different aspects of risk in different domains. We talked about risk perception, we talked about risk detection, risk management, risk preparation, and we also, just talked about risk know-how, right? And I think one of the important concepts that, and important parts of, this whole risk discussion is certainly risk communication. And so, therefore, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker for the conference, and who is truly an expert in risk communication. So this afternoon, we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Alex Freeman, who is the Executive Director of the Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication at the University of Cambridge. Right, so let me just share a few words about Dr. Alex Freeman. So before joining the Winton Center in 2016, so Dr. Alex Freeman has had a 16 years of a very illustrious career at the BBC. Right, so when she was at the BBC, she produced and directed a series, various very successful series, including Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, and Climate Change by Numbers. Right, so she has also won several awards for very impactful work, including a BAFTA, as well as a AAAS Carefully Science Journalism Gold Award. And so AAAS stands for American Association for the Advancement of Science. So at the Winton Center, Dr. Freeman has been playing a very instrumental role in helping professionals such as doctors, journalists, legal professionals to communicate numbers and uncertainty better. And she has also been advising on the use of narratives and risk communication. So with that, let us put our hands together to welcome Dr. Freeman.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm delighted to join you this afternoon, or this morning as it is for me. I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm very sorry to have missed some of the previous talks due to the time difference for me, because it sounds like you've had an amazing time, and I would love to have heard some of it. But I'm going to talk from our perspective at the Winton Center. We were founded at the end of 2016. And so the title of what we have learned, this is really what I've learned, because I came from a very different kind of communication. This work in the BBC and creating documentaries is really very different. And that's one of the things that I want to draw out today, because there you can see our motto is to inform but not persuade. And I think this is a really difficult concept, actually. Because it's a difference between communication aims that I really hadn't appreciated in my previous career. I thought that at the BBC, we were informing. I mean, it's part of the BBC's mantra is to inform, educate, and entertain. But actually, I've very much come to realize that I wasn't. When we're making documentaries, we're always trying to communicate a message or a story, a narrative. We know where we're going with it, and we know where we're leading the viewers. So if you're thinking about what's the take-home message or what's my call to action here, which are very common things that we as communicators think about, then you're almost certainly persuading rather than purely informing. Do you want people to really understand the information and the pros and the cons, make up their own mind? Or does it matter more that they believe what you're telling them? And that transfers into the outcomes that's important for you. It's much harder to measure the aims of informative communication. If your aim is to get a message across or change behavior, then it's relatively easy to measure the number of people who did a particular thing or now say that they believe a particular thing. If you're trying purely to inform people, then what sort of measures of success do you have? You really need to ask people questions to get at their comprehension of the information. And that's not just parroting back numbers at you, because as I'm going to talk about, numbers are not the thing here. A risk isn't just a number. Now, of course, inform and persuade, it's not a black and white thing. This is a spectrum. So at one extreme, you've got information being given as part of things like medical informed consent, where legally and ethically, there's an imperative not to persuade. As a doctor, you shouldn't care whether your patient opts to choose chemotherapy or hormone therapy or radiotherapy. Your job is to inform them and help them make up their own mind about what's best for them. Similarly, expert witnesses in court, the extreme end of just informing. At the other end, you've got pure marketing and you've got alert messages, pure persuasion. You overtly want people to do and not really think. And I think it's interesting to think about where different roles sit on this spectrum. Public health professionals, science advisors to government. How about your own role? For each kind of communication you do, it might be different, where you think you should be on that spectrum. If you're communicating to what you might call decision makers, perhaps they should be making the decision. And so you should be at the inform end of the spectrum and not persuading them to make a particular decision. These are kind of difficult and controversial things to discuss, I think. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. One thing that I kind of have as a little mantra in my head when I'm thinking about this, because so often when I talk about risk communication and evidence communication, is people are asking, you know, how can we do X? And I try to think, actually, it's not about the benefits that you can gain as a communicator. It's not about how you can get people to do what you want them to do. It's about what benefits you can give as a communicator. And actually, after making this slide, though, I've even been thinking about this more and thinking, even this might not be right, because sometimes we're communicating information where we don't even have a specific benefit in mind. We might not even be sure what decisions people might make about this information, but our very ethos is that we have this information and that we shouldn't be keeping it to ourselves. So it may not even be that you can imagine the benefit that other people can gain, but you still feel that you should be communicating it. Again, lots of things we could discuss. So what I'm going to talk about now is, these are my thoughts on how we should be communicating evidence. And I'm coming from the perspective of communicating to inform and not persuade. And for me, it's got two main aspects: being useful and being trustworthy. Now, we know that the way you can communicate evidence can make a massive difference to people. This is a famous example from the UK, and it was a message that was released at a press conference on a Friday morning, right way back in 1995. And of course, because it was a Friday, it was already headline news by lunchtime, and then throughout the weekend, it was all through the press. And it was this message that the third generation oral contraceptive pill doubled the rate of potentially fatal venous thrombosis. And this was the result if you look at the statistics for the UK in the following 12 months. It's really dramatic how much risk communication can affect people's lives. But if you actually look at what the absolute risks are for having a venous thrombosis in the case of the second generation contraceptive pill and the third generation oral contraceptive pill, it's about 1 in 7,000, which indeed doubles to around 2 in 7,000 for the third generation pill. And ironically, in pregnancy, it's higher again. And so I think you can see that if this communication had been put in terms of the absolute risks, a lot of people would have probably made very different life choices. It's not just about the numbers, it's about how we perceive them. And so it's really important that we think about the potential for the numbers and the risks that we're communicating to have a real impact and a real change in people's lives. But here's another case to consider. How should the information have been communicated in the case of the L'Aquila earthquake that killed over 300 people back in Italy? And you may remember that people were convicted for the way that the evidence was communicated or not communicated. There was a sense of reassurance. People were told not to worry, that the chances of an earthquake were very low. Well, they were very low. They almost always are very low in seismic risks. The absolute probability was, I believe, around 0.1%, but it was about 100 times higher than the background probability because there'd been some seismic activity in that region. So no one's arguing that evacuation was warranted. You know, it's a very low chance of a serious earthquake, but the reassurance also wasn't warranted. Here, the relative risks, the difference between the background and the current probabilities, were a really important part of understanding what the risks were in this situation and how people might feel about it. So it's quite subtle. It's not always an obvious set of rules and guidelines that we can work by when we're wanting to communicate risks. So the first thing we need to think about is always, what is the right information? What should we be communicating here? So I always try to think about, what do people really need or want to know? What sort of decisions might people be making on the basis of what we're informing them about? And this sometimes means talking to your audience. What's important to them? What sort of outcomes are important to them? And then what information do they feel they need to have to make an informed decision? And it's important to try and target the information, because if you're giving people unnecessary information, it means they're less likely to get and understand the necessary information. So it is really important to try and get across just the information that people really need. But people do want to also have information about where the numbers, the information that you're giving them comes from, so they can judge its quality and trustworthiness, and we'll come to that. So here's an example that you may have seen in the last year. This was the first visualization that we produced for the UK's National Science Advisors for a national broadcast when the COVID vaccines were first being rolled out. We'd been asked to produce something, but it was up to us to think about what information was actually helpful to people. So we did a lot of thinking and came down to the decision that people were probably trying to make was whether to be vaccinated or not. And so they were probably wanting to weigh up the potential of being hospitalized with COVID or having a serious outcome from COVID if they were vaccinated versus if they weren't vaccinated. So we used these current average prevalence in the UK to calculate the absolute risks of somebody being hospitalized with COVID if they were vaccinated and hospitalized with COVID if they weren't vaccinated. And we presented it in this way that it showed it as a natural kind of weighing up on the one hand, on the other hand. And we broke it down by age because there's so much variation of the risk depending on people's age. And we hoped that this then contained the information that people wanted and in a format that allowed them to instinctively see that it was a case of weighing one thing up above the other. But then a few weeks later, this pattern of potential harms of the AstraZeneca vaccine started coming through. And again, we were tasked to help communicate this. So this time, we decided to stay with our kind of previous design of this weighing up of the potential harms and benefits. But this time, they were different things that people might be weighing up. So this shows for 100,000 people, in this case women, who were all vaccinated, what might the potential benefits be and what might the potential harms be. So the benefits, it's not now the sort of absolute risks, it's now the relative difference for the benefit. So the benefit there is ICU avoidances, the absolute difference between those vaccinated and those not vaccinated. So the benefit, the number of people who would be saved from ICU on the one hand, versus those who might be harmed by the blood clots, which were a serious thing. So again, it's weighing up on one side from the other, but they're different numbers. And we had to think about what numbers would be helpful. And again, we wanted to make it as useful as possible to the audience, which were policymakers, as well as individual members of the public. So we stratified it not only by age, but also by exposure risk. So this is low exposure, depending on your job and how exposed to the virus you might be. And we did different ones for low exposure, medium exposure, high exposure, and also for men and women, because the risk from COVID, if you get it, is quite different for the two sexes. So there were in total 6 graphics like this. But through doing that, we hoped that we were allowing people to find the information that was most relevant to them, and for policymakers to see how different policies might affect different subgroups in the population, which is important for them to be able to weigh up. One more example. So this is from our work on communicating seismic information. And this is a work in progress, so don't take it as how we're finally going to communicate this seismic information. But here, as I already discussed with L'Aquila, the absolute probabilities are almost always very small. So we've made up the numbers here, but we've given a chance of earthquakes of being, 1.4%. But we're trying to help people see the increase over the background levels, this current chance being 127 times higher than average. So here we're experimenting with giving people both absolute and relative risks to help them try and give them the information that they need to interpret this risk. And as I say, we're still working on this, and I'm going to show you some of the things we're doing with it a little bit later. So when you've thought about the right information, how to communicate it. I mean, I've already talked a little bit about what we're trying to do with some of the communication, but here we need to think about what risk really is. And it's not just a number. You've been thinking about risk perception already, but it is very important to think that there is a likelihood component, of course, which can be seen as a number of some kind, but there's the perception of it as well. A 10% chance of losing your hair as a result of medical treatment is very different from the 10% chance of dying as a result of a medical treatment. And so you might be thinking, okay, so the risk is 2 numbers or 2 quantities, likelihood and impact, but it's more than that as well. There's context and there's format. So I'm going to talk about these 2 aspects which can affect how we communicate. So if we think about numbers in a domain that's really familiar to us, then this is obvious. We all have our own sense of value that we attach to the numbers involved when we're familiar with them. But it's also obvious that the value is very context dependent. Is $100 a lot of money for a bar of chocolate? Yes. For a laptop? No. For a 10-year-old? Yes. But for a well-paid CEO? No. So you can see your sense of value of the money depends on the object attached to it and the personal characteristics of the person sort of owning that money. And that's exactly the same thing as a risk. So as I said, the 1% chance of having a headache or 1% chance of dying, very different. But also a 1% chance of dying for a 90-year-old versus a 1% dying for a 10-year-old, very different. So the context we give people for the numbers matters a lot. We can't just give them a single absolute risk, but how do we choose what to give them to compare that with? So here's an example of when we were trying to work out how to communicate people's personalized risk from COVID. And this was the work that we were doing was talking about their medical risk. So the risk of dying if you catch COVID. So the absolute risk is on its own, it's low, but it's kind of meaningless as well. If you're told your risk is X%, how do you know whether that's high or low? So you think a relative risk is important in there, but relative to what? What sort of context is useful? It's not like earthquakes where you've got an average risk, a sort of baseline that you can compare back to, or a time series. You could give it relative to other causes of death for that person, like your chances of cardiovascular disease or cancer or being hit by a bus. But are these actually helpful to people? What about relative to another person? But would that be helpful? And who? So we actually interviewed quite a lot of people and we asked them, what does high risk and low risk mean to you? And we were actually trying to get a number out of them. We wanted them to tell us what they thought high and low was on a scale. But nobody can come up with a number off the top of their head. They don't know the context. They don't know what sort of numbers you're talking about. And people don't think in numbers. What they said to us, though, was, oh, high risk to me for COVID is something like a 90-year-old person, probably a man with diabetes or a respiratory condition. And a low risk is a healthy young person with no health conditions. So people thought in personas, they thought of these people. So we made this scale, a risk ladder, that helped people with people personas that they could imagine on the one side. And then it meant you could put you are here, your risk is here on the other side. And you could put that so that it moved up and down depending on the person's actual risk. And people found this helpful. They found that this then put it in context for them. But it was only through interviewing people that we realized what was an appropriate context for them. And they found it was more helpful than, say, comparing their risk of COVID against risks from other disease. We did try comparing your risk of COVID against seasonal flu because that was something that seemed similar. And people did find that quite helpful, but not as helpful as comparing within the risk, as we call it now. So going back to the seismic communication then, we're now working on whether this same approach might help for earthquakes. Does putting the chance of an earthquake in your area against the chances in other places, other cities that you might now have a sense of high or low risk in, help? So people do know that Tokyo is a high seismic hazard. Don't criticize our numbers here. Again, this is work in progress. We're slightly making them up. But our problem actually has been that people don't have a sense of a low hazard city because they say, oh, well, I've never heard of an earthquake in, say, London, but I don't know if that's just my ignorance or that they just haven't had one. These things are very rare anyway. So finding low hazard cities is actually quite difficult. But again, we're playing with this and modifying it on the basis of interviews that we're doing with people. But we do find that people, it helps to give this risk in context with similar risks or the risk of the same thing. So the other thing then that I wanted to talk about was format and the differences that different formats can make. So it's not just the number. Think about how each of these numbers makes you feel. They're all quite different. Which of these seems bigger? And we've actually done an experiment specifically, again, within the COVID context when we're doing that work on communicating COVID risk. And we wanted to see what effect, how risky people felt each format was. So the first group of people got risks given to them as percentages. And when they were given a little slider and asked, how risky from not at all to very risky does each of these numbers, if it were your risk of dying from COVID, feel to you? So you can see people, as the numbers go up, people felt they were riskier, of course. But another group of people were given those numbers as X out of 100. It's the same risk, but now you can see that actually people who were given it in this format, each of those numbers felt riskier. And then another group were given that as a 1 in X format. 1 in 100, 1 in 20, 1 in 8, 1 in 5. And you can see these felt much riskier again. So the format that you choose really makes a difference to how people perceive that number, perceive that risk. So again, as risk communicators, we've got to bear this in mind. You've got a lot of power in your hands. If you're just trying to inform and not persuade, if you're trying to persuade, sure, take this playbook and play with it. You can put your 1 in X and you can make things look riskier. But if you're just trying to inform, you need to be careful. And what about this? This is framing. So this example is a little bit topical at the moment. Imagine that your country is preparing for an outbreak of, I don't know, some respiratory disease that is expected to have a high mortality rate. And you've got to choose a vaccine from different companies. Now, I just want you to think in your head, which of these two vaccines would you choose? One that's claiming that it's going to save 2,000 children, and one that's saying that there's a third probability that 6,000 children will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that none will be saved. Well, okay. Now, a month later, you've got to order more vaccine, and you've got different claims. So which Which vaccine are you going to choose now? The one where 4,000 children are going to die? Or the one where there's a third probability that none will die and a 2/3 probability that 6,000 will die? Well, I'm guessing that most of you chose these two options. And that you spotted that, of course, this is just a matter of changing the framing. One of them, you're saving people. One of them, you're sadly realizing that you're not saving people. And of course, if it's framed in terms of lives saved, you make a different, that you want that certainty. Whilst if you're not saving people, you want the possibility of avoiding that loss. So you make different choices depending on how things are framed. And again, as risk communicators, we've got to be aware of this and think about how we're communicating. So I've talked a lot about, so far, being useful, giving people the right information in a way that they can understand it. But at the Winton Centre, we have another really important strand in how we think about communication, and that's how to make it trustworthy. Trustworthiness is firstly something different from aiming to be trusted. So often we talk to organisations and they say to us, how do we get people to trust us? And our answer always is that they're aiming for the wrong thing. That's not in your gift to make people trust you. I mean, that's manipulative if that's your aim. But your aim can be to be trustworthy, to earn people's trust. It's a little bit of a subtle distinction, and the best way to understand the difference is to listen to the expert on trust and trustworthiness, Dame Honora O'Neill. And this is a still of her TED Talk, which I really recommend. It's only 10 minutes long and you absolutely won't regret it. And she talks about trust and trustworthiness in organizations. So given that we're aiming to be trustworthy then, the first of the two aspects of trustworthiness that I want to talk about is being balanced. It's what you say, being open about the pros and the cons. So how balanced does this typical piece of official COVID vaccine communication sound? I mean, clearly not very. And this is very typical. I'm sure you've all seen these sorts of messages come from governments and health organizations. And you can see that when you're trying to give a message, that classic communication technique, providing the potential harms would be conflicting, complicating. It dumbs down, it makes that message much less clear. And that's why evidence communication is a really different kind of communication from what most of us learn when we're communicators. It's not about giving a nice, simple, clear message. So this would be the other extreme, giving people the full information on the harms as well as the benefits of, in this case, the same thing, COVID vaccination. This is called a fact box. It's best practice in medicine when you need informed consent. And we, among others, have shown that this helps people understand and remember the information. But most people would say that this amount of detail on the potential harms of vaccines could put people off. And some might say it's even irresponsible as a result to try and communicate this. It's certainly very different from the classic messages that you would expect to see about vaccination. So we empirically tested this format against simpler message-based communication. And despite people's concerns, it improved people's feelings of being informed about making a decision, and it didn't change the decision that they made. So actually, a lot of the work around COVID vaccination has found that messages tend not to, or communications, I should say, tend not to make that much of a difference about people's decision. The decision about COVID vaccination seems to be a very sort of heart-centered decision, and it's not one that's moved a lot by information. But they did feel more informed about it. And I'll go on to talk about some further experiments that we've done. But it's important to think that your instincts about what people will do when given information may well be wrong. You have to test these things empirically to find out. So, accuracy then. By accuracy, I don't just mean getting the numbers right. I mean, Obviously, it helps to have your percentages add up to 100% if you're talking about voting, but there's more to it than that. So if we look at this story, for example, from my old colleagues at the BBC, it's a good looking story. We've got good numbers in it. It looks like it comes from a good source. But you might be already thinking, oh, hang on, unemployment falls by 3,000. That's not very much. Is that a fall? Is that a significant fall? And you might choose to go and look up the actual numbers from the Office of National Statistics on their website. And if you really dug down and went through a lot of menus on their website, you would find here 3,000 is plus or minus 77,000. So it might have gone up, unemployment might have gone down. We simply can't tell. The uncertainty around this figure was key to the story and how much faith we should put in it. And if you think about a decision that you're basing on the facts put before you, you need to know the accuracy and the precision of those figures. Because here, for instance, you definitely would want to know that that was 3,000 plus or minus 77,000. But people worry about communicating uncertainty. They worry that it's going to undermine people's trust. So again, we have to do empirical studies to see if these worries are founded on anything. So we've been doing uncertainty communication experiments for a couple of years now. Here again, some more during COVID. So here's one where we were giving people a statement with a number in it, and they either saw it with no uncertainty, or they saw it with numerical uncertainty here, saying there was a range, or just some verbal uncertainty, saying there's some uncertainty about it. It could be higher or lower. And we've done this across 12 countries with over 10,000 people. And what we found was that it made very little difference at all to people's trust in the information, and certainly not with the providers of the information. Giving uncertainty in this way doesn't undermine people's trust. People are fine with being given answers that have a numerical range around it. But there is a circumstance in which that isn't true. So, communicating about the quality of the underlying evidence. So this is a different kind of uncertainty. It's not a easily quantified uncertainty. We call it the indirect uncertainty because it's the uncertainty around the evidence, not the uncertainty around the estimate that's come out of the evidence. So here we manipulated what quality of evidence label people were given here. Some were given a low quality of evidence, some were told it was high quality of evidence, some were given no information at all about the quality of the evidence. And we asked people how much they trusted it, and how much we asked them about the effectiveness, what they thought of the effectiveness of eye protection. We asked them if they thought they would use eye protection. And what we found that was, as you'd expect, if they were told the quality of the evidence was low, then they trusted it less. So that makes complete sense. But if they were given no information about the quality of the underlying evidence, then they trusted it as much as if we told them it was high quality of evidence. And that bled through into their feelings of the effectiveness and their likelihood of taking the eye protection in this case. And I think this is really important, that people seem to assume that the quality of evidence is high unless we tell them otherwise. So if you are a risk communicator and you're not telling people that your quality of evidence is low, if it is, then are you lying by omission? You know that you'll be affecting people's trust in the information and the way that they respond to that information. And I think that's a really interesting ethical question. So the one thing I want to end on is bringing all this together. We've been looking at the actual effect of bringing everything that we've talked about today into messages and seeing what effect that has on people. So we've been testing standard persuasive government messages about COVID vaccination and also now about nuclear power, another sort of controversial area where people have pro and anti views, versus a message that's edited to contain balance, the harms, the benefits, the uncertainties, being upfront about the quality of the evidence. And so we tested people and we gave them one message or the other. And I'm going to give you a sneak preview of our unpublished results. This is for the COVID vaccination message, but also we've just had exactly the same from the nuclear. And what we found was that for people who had negative views, so for people who had positive views about the subject, so were pro-vaccine or pro-nuclear, the two different messages made no difference at all. They already trusted the information, they already trusted the producers of the information, they were engaged with it, they saw it as high quality evidence. But for people who were anti-vaccine or anti-nuclear, they had a greater trust in the information if it was adapted to be more trustworthy. I mean, it's what we'd hope, but you can see also they trusted the producers more, they saw it as higher quality evidence, they were more engaged with it. It didn't, again, shift their decision in the case of the vaccine. In the case of the nuclear, we found the persuasive message did seem to indeed persuade people to be pro-nuclear. But what was important to us is not the decision that people made, but how informed they felt and what they felt about the messaging. And I think it's really interesting and really important for us to think that if we are trustworthy, that is noticed by people, and particularly the people who have negative views about what we might be communicating about. And I think that's really important for us to bear in mind. And perhaps an interesting indicator that perhaps we need to trust our audiences more, to be able to assess information and to give them open, balanced information and let them make their own decisions based on it. And I'm not saying we do this if it's an acute emergency, a fire alarm, an evacuation order. That's where you need persuasive messaging. But where you're giving people information for them to make up their own mind, I think we can trust our audiences a bit more. So in summary then, when you're communicating risks, I think you should be thinking about your context, your format, giving balance, and giving your uncertainties. And I think if we do all of that, and we give people the information that they need in a way that's trustworthy, then we can trust them in return to make up their own mind about it. So to end on, I would like to just announce that we have just yesterday announced the Harding Prize for Trustworthy Communication. So if you think that you are producing trustworthy communication, or you've seen really good trustworthy communication and useful communication around, do enter. There's the URL. And yeah, you've got till the end of the month to nominate your most trustworthy information of the year. And on that note, I shall finish because I really want to hear your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman, for your really insightful sharing. So at this time, we'd like to open the floor for Q&A. And so I can see that I have quite a few questions that have really come in. And so maybe let me just start with a very quick question that I have. Okay, so you've actually shared a lot about the importance of considering the context, the format, the framing effects, and the trustworthiness of numbers, right, in risk communication. So I think one of the things that people often use in risk communication is emotion-laden words, right? So emotional appeals. So could you comment on the role of emotions in risk communication, whether in terms of informing or persuading, and how these emotions could actually be add-on or complement numbers and risk communication, and to what extent would this use actually backfire? Yeah, thanks.
Well, I don't know what to use it would backfire, but I mean, risk perception is an emotional response, and if you're communicating with emotionally laden language, you're already manipulating people's emotional. So you are being persuasive. So if you want to be persuasive, if you're a persuasive communicator and you're trying to make people feel a particular way and perhaps do a particular thing, then I'm sure that emotional language will do that. But just bear in mind, I'd say, that people did notice. So in that experiment I just presented about trustworthy communication, we got people to rate whether they felt that this message was being persuasive or not. And we got people to rate things like their emotional reactance against it. So did they feel annoyed that they were being manipulated? And as I said, it's the people who were more skeptical about the message in the first place, or the information, the topic in the first place, who were more sensitive to feeling manipulated. And so I do worry that if you use emotional language and you want to persuade, that the people that you possibly most want to persuade, the people who are initially most skeptical, are probably the ones who are going to be more sensitive to feeling that you're trying to manipulate them if you use emotional language. So this is also why I think that it's potentially persuasive to use narrative, because narrative tends to engage people's emotions. We think about engagement when we think about narrative. And engagement can be a good thing, but can narrative ever be used to purely inform, or does narrative always persuade? This is one of our research projects that we're doing at the moment, and I think it's a really interesting question. But when it comes to purely information, I think that emotions are something that you need to be very careful of trying to manipulate.
Thank you so much. So we actually have a question from one of the online participants, and so allow me to read this question. So good afternoon, Dr. Freeman. So I was wondering whether you can comment on the increasing incidence and rising phenomenon in which fake news components and anti-vax social media campaigners tend to cite published data and findings from reputable experts, institutions, while disputing counter-experts to authenticate their claims about the COVID virus and vaccines within the context of risk misrepresentation, risk stigmatization of experimental vaccines, and risk miscommunication. Right. So this is really a question about the use of numbers in order to spread fake news. Yeah.
So really, that's talking about persuasive communication and cherry-picking evidence, isn't it? So it's just, they are being untrustworthy communicators in that they are selecting the evidence to create a message. I think you have to think about whether people on both sides might do that. And you're thinking, this is just using persuasive communication. And if you happen to be skeptical of the anti-vax message, then you spot that, you react against it. And if somebody who is anti-vax reads a persuasive message which only shows the pros and not the potential harms, then they spot that and they react against that. So I think, both sides can play that game, and it's incumbent on us to be trustworthy communicators as much as possible and show potential benefits and potential harms, to discuss them openly, and then let people make up their own mind by weighing them up. And I don't mean giving false balance, I mean being open to the fact that there may be potential harms for some people. And so that then they can weigh up those potential harms and see, well, for me, maybe those potential harms are much lower than the potential benefits. But you are being upfront that there may be potential harms.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. Could we have a question perhaps like from the floor? Yeah. Francis, yes. Olivia.
Okay. Alex, thank you. Oh, sorry. Mask on. Alex, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. You mentioned that the fact boxes didn't make a difference to people's decisions. Does it make any difference informing people to the way people feel about their decisions afterwards?
Interesting. So we've asked people about how well informed they felt and used some of the decision confidence scales. And you can help people feel more confident in their decisions or better informed about their decisions. It's quite difficult to work out what, as a communicator, if you're trying to support people's decisions, whether you should be making decisions easier to make or not. So that it's actually quite difficult to think of what you're trying to do, because maybe if you're giving a really simple message and just saying do this or do that, then that's probably going to end up being a simple message. Whilst you might actually want people to think about it quite hard, and it might be a harder decision to make. But as you say, the important thing would be to look down the line at decision regret, versus feeling that you made the best decision at the time. In the case of the COVID vaccination, that kind of thing, that hasn't been done. Well, no, we haven't done it. I haven't seen it in the literature. People may have done it that I haven't read, but I don't know of it. But that is the kind of thing that's done a lot in medical communication, where people look at decision regret, later down the line. But it's very difficult to know how far down the line, if you're helping people making a decision about chemotherapy, maybe 5-10 years down the line, that you would need to come back and say, how do you feel about the decision that you made way back then now that sort of all the pros and cons have played out, really. So yeah, that is a really good measure, and a really interesting measure to look at, and no, we haven't looked at it.
Thank you. So let's take maybe one final question. Yeah.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you very much. I really loved your presentation and the focus on trust at the end. In the last maybe 10-20 years, it's become very fashionable to become activists about different causes, and we see more and more people coming to the barricade and always arguing very strongly about what they believe is our just cause. Have you explored particular campaigns that actually have proven completely counterproductive because people were pushing so hard for their argument, and in fact were basically building argument for people who, or basically arming their own cause by doing so?
No, I haven't studied that. The area of looking at trust and institutional trust is a really big and complex area. But I do think that it's interesting that you bring up this point about researchers and scientists who have strong opinions, because of course we all do have strong opinions, and it's if you work in areas of climate change or seismic science or any area, you're going to have opinions about what maybe should be done policy-wise, or how other individuals should think about your subject. And I think of course that's absolutely fine, but I think that we have to be very honest with ourselves when we make our communications about whether we're doing it with an inform or a persuade hat on. And I think there is absolutely a place for persuasion and an absolute place for being an activist, but you have to do that overtly. You can't pretend that you're just trying to inform people when you do that. And what I suspect will happen, and I know that some people have looked at the longer term picture, is that if you are very if you present your results as very certain, or if you, not necessarily your results, but if you present your opinions as very certain, your findings as very certain, and then, which is part of what we're saying about being trustworthy, is being upfront about uncertainties, and then things unfold to show that that certainty was misplaced, then that does undermine trust, and that does, in the future, I suspect that if you're playing the long game, if you are less trustworthy in your communication, then you will undermine people's trust in the longer term. And so I think if you are a scientist with strong opinions and you want to be an activist, then do it overtly. Make the decision that you are going to be persuasive, and you're going to be upfront, that you're telling people you are being persuasive and you are communicating in order to change people's behavior and change people's opinions, because that is your stated intent. And you as a scientist and an expert have these beliefs based on your expertise. But don't do it when you're communicating in a journal, or if you're communicating and saying that you're just informing people. Just be overt about it and separate the two forms of communication.
Thank you so much. So on that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Alex Freeman and spending her time with us, as well as sharing all these insights with us. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've finally come to the end of the conference. So I'm going to hand the floor back to Nathaniel. Yeah.